Content warning for a lot of stuff. This manga is not fun. My Broken Mariko is the shortest existential crisis plus emotional breakdown double whammy I've ever received, and it's only grown on me in the 2 years I procrastinated making this video. Not out of any unwillingness to talk about this masterpiece, there's no other word for it, but because it wears its quality and heart so proudly and directly on its sleeve that any bastardized summary I try to make of its humanity will feel criminal. It's a heavy story about trauma, abuse, and everybody who is impacted by it, which feels so grounded and confessional that it breaks through the, understandably, lack of breathing room to be subtle or metaphorical in 4 chapters, and leaves a lasting impact. If something like Karasumi Punpun is the Glow Part 2, My Broken Mariko is the Crow Looked at Me. If anybody gets that reference, I'll kiss them. One is an abstract tapestry of ideas, concepts, emotions, while the other just pours all of its devastating realities out in plain sight to the point that you can't help but be enamored by it. And just like that album, the best way to experience this manga is to just read it yourself, which I hope I've somewhat convinced you of after all my glazing. I then will provide the only thing I really could have this whole time, my own emotional journey with this story, how it made me revisit memories I never thought I would, and how it reminded me of simple, profound truths. This is how My Broken Mariko broke me in 4 chapters. So far in my life, I've luckily never suffered trauma, and never had somebody close to me who was deeply affected by it. I sat on the sidelines for a few instances where somebody's trauma wrecked themselves and the people closest to them, but only ever as an observer. I think this is why the initial angle of My Broken Mariko grabbed me so much. This story is about 2 people, Mariko and Tomio. The girl who was told she was unlovable her whole life, and the girl who loved her despite it all. But the story begins with Mariko's suicide, and we spent the rest of the story with a lone Tomio who has to grapple with her death, her memories, and what all of it even meant. It's specifically focused on people around the traumatized person, which is not only unique, but it's also something I selfishly thought I could relate to more. And in a way I was wrong, but also more right than I would have ever wanted. To back up a bit more, the first chapter is spent introducing the characters and the scenario. Tomio randomly finding out her best friend took her own life, and remembering her abusive past, going to retrieve her ashes. The way the abuse is portrayed is fucking heart-wrenching. The art, which is usually rather stylized and messy, goes hyper-real on every single wound on Mariko's sobbing face, and later when she confesses to her own dad sexually abusing her and her mom blaming her for it, cuts so deep with such simple words. I'm leaving out a lot more ramblings on the pacing and structure because I want to keep this video mostly a character and thematic study, but I need to point out how through a visual cue, this moment is immediately followed by the image of her dad sitting next to her ashes. Right away, this picture triggers an emotional response in us, and we in this instance feel just like Tomio as she storms in with a fucking knife and grabs the ashes from the dad, cursing him out for the horrible person he is and how he doesn't deserve to grieve for Mariko. But we're reminded that this is a story just as much about the people left behind as Mariko herself. As Tomio escapes out of the window, we get these panels of the dad's second wife weakly pushing him and asking where it all went wrong, and him looking like a husk. His regrets, his mistakes, his maybe genuine love, it's too late for any of that. Waka Hirako didn't need to draw this extra scene, but its inclusion adds so much dimension to these characters and gives the story incredible nuance. That nuance hangs over our head throughout the relatively simple second chapter. Not to take anything away from it, it's a well-written chapter all about how Mariko and Tomio became best friends in school, how they used to exchange letters, and how they shared their dreams with each other. That is powerfully contrasted with the grief Tomio feels now that Mariko is gone, until she remembers the one thing she can do for her friend right now. Go to a place she always yearned for, Marigaoka Cape. The joy on Tomio's face after realizing that is unparalleled. But the complexity Chapter 1 establishes inevitably makes you suspect the relationship between the two of them. It seems just a bit too rose-colored, somewhat idealized in its tragedy. The only people they have left is each other and all that. But to be honest, by this point in the story, even if that was true, I wouldn't have minded. I liked the story for what it was, a compelling portrayal of abuse and Tomio's journey to fulfill her deceased friend's wish. But My Broken Mariko isn't satisfied with just depicting abuse. It wants to, no, demands the reader to confront its consequences. Chapter 3 immediately reveals that Tomio's initial memories of Mariko in Chapter 2 were, realistically and understandably, cherry-picked into the most positive moments. As Tomio gets more and more fatigued from this sudden runaway operation, and as she gets progressively more drunk, unpleasant memories resurface.
もししーちゃんに彼氏とかできたら私死ぬから。
は？
死ぬからね私。
いや、そんなん作る気もないけど。どうした？なんかあった？
何かない日なんてないの。
The last line especially hits. Again, I'm not gonna pretend I know anything on a super personal level, but I used to talk to a person who was also severely mentally ill and came up in bad circumstances. And this was how conversations with them would usually go. Any remark that might just bounce right off with other people, they took as another acknowledgement of their trauma, which always loomed over them. They also used to harm themselves. They told me it was a way to feel something. Anything. Mariko is deathly afraid that her only friend Tomio will abandon her, throw her away, like all the people in her life that were supposed to care for her. She copes with it by cutting her wrist and gets attached to Tomio to a frankly unhealthy degree, threatening to never forgive her or even die if she ever found someone else, because anyone's better than her. Right? I saw similar scenarios play out between the aforementioned person and their partner. From the little context I had, it got very ugly very often. The fact that I could even connect this chapter to my real life already exceeded my expectations. Depictions of abuse and trauma in anime often focus on the tragic events themselves, teetering on sympathy bait. Oh, look how horrible this character has it, feel for her, which I don't even hate if done right, but it's clear that my broken Mariko is taking the difficult, ugly route. It gives us a harrowing reminder that trauma cannot be boiled down to what happened. So much, if not most of it, is about living with that trauma. How it seeps into every part of someone's life and forces them into patterns of thinking that hurts both themselves and the people who love them the most. And if there's one thing I learned, even as a bystander, is that there are no winners in this situation. Everybody still gets hurt, no matter how intimately you understand why they hurt each other. But the part that really blows me away is that despite remembering all of that, there's not a shred of resentment in Tomio's words. She only mourns that she would never talk to her best friend again, that the memories of her will fade away. Despite Mariko being the fragile, complicated, and hurt person she is, Tomio still genuinely valued this relationship, which was probably one of the only meaningful connections both of them had in this world. And instead of doing the easier thing, discarding that bond because Mariko did so many things to hurt her, Tomio confronts her grief head-on, and thus taking the first actual step in coming to terms with her loss. It's fucking powerful. But the story does not end there. Now that you've understood and embraced the full extent of the traumatized person in your grief, what is there more to do? Well, of course, to deconstruct that from the ground up. What does Tomio actually know about Mariko? That is the question the final chapter of My Broken Mariko explores. After waking up from her drunken stupor, Tomio starts talking to the only side character in the story, Makio, who tells her to take care of herself. And Tomio responds with,
同じこと言ったっけな。私もあの子に。でもそんなの何にもなんなかった。どんなに心から心配してみせたってそんなもんじゃどうにもならないところにあの子はいたんだよね。
We see another memory of Tomio fighting off a violent boyfriend for Mariko, only to see her return to him and get her arm broken. In the cafe, Tomio gets angry at her, questioning if her brain is broken, which is unexpectedly followed by a resounding,
そうだよ。私ぶっ壊れてるの。ぶっ壊れてるお前が悪いって散々言われた。もうどっから直していけばいいのか分かんなくなっちゃった。
These memories are a lot of things. It continues delving into the consequences of abuse introduced in the last chapter, especially in how Mariko seems to get very attached to romantic partners. In my view at least, it again establishes the toxicness seeping through their friendship, with Mariko saying she is almost glad that whenever she gets hurt, Tomio worries for her, like some kind of fucked up way to affirm her own worth through hurting another person. But above all of that, this is when Tomio realized that maybe she couldn't help. Maybe her words and efforts never fully reached Mariko. I think back to when I tried to advise my old friends some things to better their situation. You know, generic things like being mindful of your time and journaling, none of which remotely helped, because their trauma ran deeper than anything I could have said. In these moments, I truly had to come to terms with my own powerlessness. Not even any tangible power that could get them out of the shit they were in, but emotional intelligence that could make them feel like they're not alone, make them feel heard, make them feel understood. I constantly asked myself, what the fuck did I even know about them? We don't know why Mariko took her own life. Maybe it had nothing to do with Tomio. But the very thought that the person Tomio thought she knew was actually so much further away from her that their connection couldn't stop her death is already capable of wrecking her. And seeing this, I at least couldn't help but wonder that maybe, just maybe, we simply can't help. No matter if it's concrete steps or a shoulder to cry on, maybe whatever metaphysical gap between two people's universes could never be bridged, and we can't ever understand a person well enough, can't ever get close enough to actually pull them out of the darkest of pits, no matter how hard we try. That fear is paralyzing. Which is why initially I couldn't get into the ending of My Broken Mariko. Tomio, after going through these memories, instead of figuring out any conclusion really, just stumbles into a situation that reminded her of Mariko, and through actually saving this stranger with Mariko's ashes, finally frees herself from Mariko and finds closure in her grief. In the very end, it's even revealed that Mariko wrote one final letter to Tomio, showing that every doubt Tomio had about their connection ended up being unnecessary. It's for sure executed incredibly poetically, and the line,
灰になってもあんた変わんない。キラキラしてつかめなくて風に流されてそして重力に逆らえない
hits like a truck attached to a meteor attached to the Andromeda Galaxy. But I stubbornly couldn't accept brushing off of what in my head constituted as a deeply important existential fear about the possibility of connection. I wanted some answer to the dread stemming from the inability to help and understand, but all I got was a dramatization, something I thought My Broken Mariko was deliberately trying not to be. I was honestly disappointed. This is one of the reasons I struggled finishing the video, because I couldn't find a conclusion in this manga that felt satisfying to present. Of course, there was also the possibility that I simply just misinterpreted or overthought the short story, and found a dead end doing so. After a while, I was certain this idea was gonna stay dormant, like all the other ones on my Google Docs that never saw the light of day. But life has a funny way of catching up to you. Last year, while trying to write this video, I flew from Latvia, where I lived, back to my home country, China, for the first time in 4 years. Right as we landed, we heard the news that my grandma didn't have much time left. I had many memories of her. Back when I lived in China, we visited her and took her out traveling every chance we could. I remembered going to Qingdao with her, and seeing her wake up at like 4 AM in the hotel to do her daily stretches, which she's apparently maintained for over 30 years. I remember the 3 80s shows she'd exclusively watch once we got a modern TV. I remember using the old-fashioned wood-powered stove with her and getting the warm smoke all up on my face. But as the years went on, there was no denying that me and her led entirely different lives. I moved to the other side of the planet when I was 9, she hadn't left her village in over 90 years. I worried about internet bullshit, she never even owned a cell phone. Most crucially, I spoke English and Latvian better than Chinese by this point. She didn't know a lick of Mandarin and only spoke a regional dialect I never learned as a city boy. Eventually, you know, as a rebellious teenager does, I wanted to distance myself from my grandma, from my lineage, because I simply didn't see myself in it anymore. And despite objections, nobody could really blame me for that. But that crumbled faster than I ever expected when we got her cancer diagnosis. At that moment, nothing else lingered in my mind but the realization that I'd never had a proper conversation with her. This person who meant so many things to me and the people around me, I could never actually connect with. And right as she's about to be gone, I couldn't even cheer her up. Sitting in the hospital with her was the most helpless I've probably ever felt. In that powerless grief, I thought back to the story. I remembered Tomio's expression when Mariko confessed she was broken. Despite being in very different circumstances, I couldn't think of a better way to encapsulate everything I was feeling at that time. One day, while we were staying in the countryside to take better care of her, my dad asked me to go on a walk with him and Grandma. On a hot summer night, we strolled the narrow streets of our village, and many people came up to talk to us. My dad recognized and told me about each and one of them. This one was a distant uncle, this one went to the same middle school, this one used to have their family's field right next to ours. My grandma had known all of them for most of her life. Their conversations mostly ended up surrounding me and Dad. We don't come around here often, but we were quite famous. We're the family that went abroad after all, the family that found a way out. 有出息, in other words. And now they've returned, with a tall, healthy grandson who spoke English and acted like a foreigner. As my grandma exchanged pleasantries with her acquaintances, my dad whispered into my ear, "This is all your grandma ever wanted. To walk around the village with her son and grandson that she is so proud of." I held back my tears or whatever overwhelming emotion that was. Of course, the answer to my fear was so obvious. It doesn't matter that you may not understand somebody. It doesn't matter whether you could, quote unquote, help them. All that matters is that we meant something to each other. Every person is their own world, separated from other worlds in an infinite void. We spend our whole lives navigating that void, afraid that we'll never really find our way into another person's world, no matter how much we try. In that fear, it's easy to forget a profound truth, that even the limited intersection between those worlds is enough. I don't know and can't know my grandma's life, but I know I was her pride and joy for simply being there, being her grandson. Is that traditional and kind of short-sighted? Yeah, but that's her world. And I love her for it. I know that for sure. And that is enough. I know now that my broken Mariko didn't brush off that fear. It provided the right and only answer, the same answer. After remembering the conversation at the cafe, above everything, above the damage Mariko's done to Tomio and herself, Tomio's only question is why Mariko left without taking her along with her. She doesn't know and she'll never know, but her overwhelming, self-destructive proclamation of love spells nothing out but that Mariko meant something to her. And that's all she needs to grieve for her, to think about her, to love her.
考えたんですけど、もういない人に会うには自分が生きてるしかないんじゃないでしょうか。あなたの思い出の中の大事な人とあなた自身を大事にしてください。
Life moves on. Tomio returns to her office life. I flew back to the other side of the planet, and I broke my phone. Goddamn. I don't want to repeat the same ideas or say anything cliche like, the dead is still with us. So instead of saying anything too faux poetic, I'll leave it at this. Waka Hirako uploaded the first chapter of My Broken Mariko on a webcomic site in 2019, with no previous track records online. Her only works are My Broken Mariko and an untranslated short story collection she drew in 2020, after which she has stayed entirely inactive. Given the way the story was published, its rough art style, and just the type of story it is, I have the overwhelming feeling that instead of trying to be commercially successful or something, this story was purely made out of a desire for it to be out there. In the rare interviews Hirako has given about My Broken Mariko, she reveals how much of it was based on her own life, more specifically her mother, who suffered under trauma just like Mariko. It's no surprise then that only she could write the story so vividly, so confessionally, and so beautifully. Her manga embodies what I think art is all about, expressing something only you could have made, but at the same time, touching other people's souls with your artistry and making them connected to their own life, their own experiences, finding universality in your own individuality. I think that's the truly incredible thing about this manga, art in general, and to an extent, YouTube, which is full of people who tell incredibly personal stories in the nichest pockets of the internet. I am not special. I'm just one of the hundreds of thousands of people to be impacted by this manga, enough to throw my measly individuality into expressing my love for it. I just hope I could encourage other people to do the same, to share their worlds with the others in this infinite void. I promise, it'll be worth it. Also, go listen to the microphones.